13. Welcome to the Cradle of Nightmares. Columbia Correctional Institution, Portage, Wisconsin. Morning of November 28, 1994. Corrections officers are making their routine rounds through the sanitation area when something unusual draws their attention. Sitting on a windowsill beside a small barred opening is inmate Christopher Scarver. The African-American man, serving a life sentence for armed robbery and murder, watches the birds outside with an almost entranced focus. Under his breath, he repeats, "God told me to do it. I'm just carrying out his mission." It's odd. Scarver is supposed to be cleaning the showers, and in that moment, the officers sense something is wrong. When they enter the section that houses the showers, the gym, and the locker room, they step into a scene that looks as though it has been lifted straight from a horror film. Two inmates lie on the floor in deep pools of their own blood, beaten so savagely they're nearly unrecognizable. Scarver had attacked them with a metal bar pulled from exercise equipment. Both men would soon die from their injuries. The first victim, Jesse Anderson, was serving time for murdering his wife. The second, Jeffrey Dahmer, was one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history, a man whose cumulative sentence approached 1,000 years. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 young men. He drugged them, killed them, dismembered their bodies, sexually assaulted them after death, and kept their skulls as decorations for a personal shrine he envisioned but never completed. His final intended victim managed to escape and alert police, leading to Dahmer's arrest. What followed were his confessions, a high-profile trial, imprisonment, and ultimately his death on the cold floor of a prison shower room. Today, we're going to examine Jeffrey Dahmer's life in detail, because his personality was far more complex and contradictory than the public image of the Milwaukee Monster. To understand how an ordinary-looking boy became one of the most infamous killers of the century, we have to begin at the very start, with his childhood and the environment that shaped him. Jeffrey's father, Lionel Herbert Dahmer, was a quiet, emotionally distant man. Focused on his chemistry studies, he dreamed of a career in research. His mother, Joyce Annette Flint, had once worked as a telephone operator. In contrast to Lionel's reserve, Joyce was intensely emotional, demanded constant attention, and often felt deprived of it. From a young age, she suffered from chronic depression and relied heavily on sedatives and tranquilizers. Lionel and Joyce married on August 22, 1959. Shortly afterward, they learned Joyce was pregnant. Her doctor immediately instructed her to stop taking her medications. What should have been a joyful time quickly became a strain. As the pregnancy progressed, Joyce grew increasingly irritable, frequently lashing out at Lionel. Many evenings he would sit in the car with a beer, delaying the moment he had to return inside. On May 21, 1960, at 4:34 p.m. in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, their son Jeffrey Lionel was born, a baby with chestnut hair and striking blue eyes. For a time, his arrival softened the tension between his parents. Joyce even kept a special journal, documenting every smile and small movement. In 1962, Lionel earned his master's degree and began a PhD program at Iowa State University. The family moved to Ames, where Jeffrey started kindergarten. But other children held little interest for him. Shy and withdrawn, he struggled to connect. In public, Joyce acted the part of a devoted mother, straightening his clothes, wiping his nose. But at home, she rarely touched him. Her attention was consumed by finding doctors willing to prescribe her pills. In March 1964, 4-year-old Jeffrey underwent 2 painful surgeries for an inguinal hernia. The experience deeply traumatized him. Before and after the operations, he suffered intense pain, even asking his parents whether the doctors had cut anything off down there. A stranger had made an incision in the most intimate part of his body and reached inside him. Psychologists who later studied Dahmer's fixation with dissection and internal organs often trace part of that obsession back to this early trauma. Yet at that age, Jeffrey was still just a child, and he soon found his first true passion: animals. Snakes, frogs, crabs, turtles, fish, wild rabbits, and a kitten named Buff became his closest companions. Around the mid-1960s, Jeffrey found several animal bones under the house. He called them his fiddlesticks and played with them constantly. Holding his pets, he imagined the bones inside them and wondered whether they looked like the ones he had found. Meanwhile, life at home grew darker each month. Lionel buried himself in work, and when he returned home, he often sat outside until Joyce fell asleep. Avoiding his wife meant avoiding his son. Jeffrey spent most of his time alone, with the TV or wandering outdoors. In the fall of 1966, Lionel accepted a research position in Doylestown, Ohio, and the family moved again. Jeffrey had to give up his beloved kitten, Buffy. Most children would have cried or resisted, but Jeffrey quietly handed the cat to her new owners and never mentioned her again. It wasn't lack of feeling. He was becoming increasingly withdrawn, learning to bury every emotion. On December 18th of that same year, Jeffrey gained a baby brother, David. A moment Joyce met with little joy, but Jeffrey embraced fully. To ease the transition, the family adopted a dog named Frisky. Decades later, long after his conviction, Dahmer recalled this dog with rare warmth. It was great having a friend like that. We'd run through the fields and play everywhere. She was a good dog. After David's birth, Joyce spent more and more time in bed, often crying quietly. Lionel hid in the garage. Jeffrey grew even more silent and withdrawn. A few months later, Joyce began complaining about constant noise from neighbors. Whether the noise was real or another symptom of her fraying nerves, Lionel didn't investigate. He moved the family again, this time to Barberton, Ohio. Once more, Jeffrey had to start over, left to navigate childhood on his own. He didn't know how to form healthy emotional bonds. He feared getting close to anyone, because closeness meant the possibility of losing them, and that early fear would one day twist into something far darker. Soon, Jeffrey realized that it really was easier this way. 1968 brought another move, the third in 2 years, and finally the last. This time, the Dahmers settled in Bath Township, Ohio. Jeffrey liked the new house. There were woods nearby, a pond just beyond them. What more could he want? At school in Bath, Jeffrey made plenty of friends, though acquaintances would be a more accurate word. The young Dahmer continued to keep people at arm's length. Joyce's depression was growing steadily worse. When Jeffrey was 7 years old, his mother took too many tranquilizers. Family members found her unconscious at home, lying in her own vomit. It was never fully determined whether the overdose was accidental or an attempt to take her own life. The latter possibility remains entirely plausible. Joyce suffered simultaneously from deep depression and pronounced egocentrism. Without medication, she spiraled into despair and lashed out at her husband, who was consumed by work and unable to give her the attention she craved. Jeffrey increasingly saw his mother angry, tense, volatile. Receiving affection from her became almost impossible. Jeffrey's teachers noted that the boy seemed abandoned. His parents were so absorbed in their own problems, that they failed to notice their son slowly sinking into isolation. "It just felt like my parents didn't love each other very much," Jeffrey Dahmer later said, reflecting on that period. "I decided early on that I never wanted to get married because I didn't want to go through something like that." There was little sense of warmth in the Dahmer household. The family had a tradition of eating dinner together, but on those evenings the tension in the kitchen felt almost tangible. Joyce was constantly on edge and could erupt into an argument right in the middle of a meal. When that happened, Jeffrey would quietly take his younger brother and leave the room, his own dinner unfinished. Eventually, Joyce was hospitalized and spent a month in a psychiatric clinic. Afterward, she underwent more than 20 psychotherapy sessions, but with little success. The amount of medication she took did not meaningfully decrease. For the rest of his life, Jeffrey believed that his mother's depression began after his birth, though this was not true. Still, he blamed himself for every relapse she suffered. In an effort to protect her, he tried not to draw attention to himself, often avoiding her altogether, acting as though he barely existed. The relationship a child has with their parents, especially with their mother, plays a crucial role in shaping personality. A mother's love and care help a child feel safe reaching out to others, understanding that they are needed and valued. Through her, a child learns emotions. When fear is appropriate, what causes hurt, what justifies anger. Jeffrey had a roof over his head and food on the table. He was never beaten, but he was deprived of the most essential things: care and attention. Joyce, overwhelmed by depression, did not help her son learn how to process emotions or integrate into society. Lionel, constantly absent due to work, did nothing to compensate for that absence. Jeffrey was left to cope on his own. Unable to communicate in ways that came naturally to others, he would later form relationships in very different ways. By the age of 11, Jeffrey seemed indifferent to almost everything. Nothing truly interested him. In any situation he didn't understand, he retreated into the woods, chopping at trees for hours, anything to avoid bothering anyone. When Lionel finally noticed that something was wrong, he first pushed his son to join the school choir, then tried teaching him how to play tennis. Jeffrey agreed obediently, but showed no real interest in sports or in any kind of group activity. While Joyce protected her own fragile peace, spending day after day in bed in her room, Jeffrey was building his own fortress. And with each passing year, its walls grew thicker and stronger. At 13, Jeffrey began to explore his body and his identity, as most teenagers do. Around this time, he met a neighborhood boy named Eric Tyson. They went fishing and hiking together, and even shared a treehouse and a makeshift fort. It was there, in their secret hideout, that Eric and Jeffrey touched, fondled, and kissed one another. Through these encounters, Jeffrey came to realize he was gay. However, the tryst soon ended. Both boys lived in fear of being discovered. Entering his mid-teens, Jeffrey's sense of isolation only deepened. By 14, he was drinking regularly, and by 16, he had added marijuana to his habits. At school, Dahmer played the role of the class clown, but his antics were bizarre. He would disrupt lessons and mimic epileptic seizures. It was a desperate plea for attention, a way to make himself seen, to make someone, anyone, interested in him. Though Jeff was bright and talented, his grades suffered under the weight of his behavioral issues and mounting alcoholism. The only subject that truly captivated him was biology. Dahmer was fascinated by animal anatomy. He loved dissecting frogs, obsessed with seeing how they functioned inside. Near the family home in Bath, stood a small, dilapidated shack. Jeff used it as a sanctuary for his extracurricular activities. He developed a habit of collecting roadkill and dead animals from the woods to study them. Inside his shack, one could find the skeletons of chipmunks, squirrels, and birds, alongside jars of insects and even mole organs preserved in formaldehyde. Once, after helping dissect a fetal pig in biology class, Jeff persuaded his teacher to let him take the head home. He later stripped the skin and flesh from it, keeping the skull as a trophy. What began as curiosity quickly spiraled into a morbid obsession. He started bringing home the carcasses of dogs, foxes, and opossums he found on the highway, cutting them open to examine their viscera. This often led to clashes with his father, who had initially encouraged Jeff's interest in anatomy, but soon grew disturbed by its intensity. It is important to note that Jeffrey Dahmer never killed these animals. He only studied those that were already dead. He wasn't a classic sadist, yet he possessed an unhealthy fixation on innards and, from a young age, displayed necrophilic tendencies. I think the irreversible change happened around 14 or 15. That's when the intrusive thoughts about violence and sex began. The fantasies kept getting worse and worse, and I didn't know how to tell anyone about them, so I just kept it all inside, Jeffrey Dahmer later recalled in an interview. By 17, Jeffrey had never been on a date. Bound by childhood trauma and a fear of abandonment, he was incapable of forming healthy bonds. He desperately craved closeness, but had no idea how to achieve it, so he began to look for other ways. The first major red flag, which, in hindsight, sounds like a deafening alarm, occurred around the time of his high school graduation. An athletic stranger used to jog past the Dahmer house almost every morning. Jeff would watch him from the window, wishing the man would notice him. But simply approaching the stranger felt impossible. Instead, Jeff began to plot a way to have the jogger entirely to himself, where he couldn't leave. The solution he devised was chilling. He planned to ambush the man, knock him unconscious with a baseball bat, drag him into the woods, and simply lie beside his senseless body. He actually bought a bat and waited by the road, but the jogger never appeared. Realizing the gravity of what he had intended, Jeff panicked and fled back to the house. By early 1978, the atmosphere at 4480 West Bath Road had reached a breaking point. Lionel and Joyce's domestic bickering had curdled into mutual hatred. Lionel would later describe that period as profoundly depressive and painful. Shortly before Christmas, they filed for divorce. Lionel moved into a motel about 10 miles away, leaving the boys behind. While the younger David was visibly distraught, Jeffrey reacted in his usual way. He withdrew and drank. On one occasion, a teacher found him on the school lawn with a 12-pack of beer. That spring, in defiance of a court order, Joyce took David and moved to Wisconsin to stay with her sister. Jeffrey was left entirely alone in the house, while his father remained at the motel. If there had been any room left in the fortress Jeffrey had built around himself, it was now sealed shut. He was 18 years old, standing in an empty house, no friends, no family, no one. Even when Lionel eventually returned, he could not erase Jeffrey's overwhelming sense of total abandonment. Jeffrey Dahmer did not make another attempt to harm the athlete he had become fixated on. Instead, he began suppressing his violent fantasies through masturbation, doing so more frequently and gradually replacing the image of the jogger with men he perceived as more sexual and more attainable. What if he picked up a young hitchhiker by the road, someone with a well-built chest, and invited him over? At that point, Jeffrey would always stall. He couldn't imagine how to keep another person with him without resorting to the most obvious and straightforward method. It was mid-June 1978 when Jeffrey Dahmer borrowed his father's car and drove along the highway, scanning for hitchhikers. Around 5 in the evening, he noticed an exceptionally attractive young man, about 19 years old, with shoulder-length chestnut hair and a bare torso, something that immediately caught Jeffrey's attention. He had a fetish for the male chest. The hitchhiker noticed Dahmer's car himself and soon took the passenger seat. His name was Stephen Hicks. Jeffrey suggested they go back to his house, have some beer, and relax. Hicks agreed. They spent time together, talking and drinking. But before long, Jeffrey realized that Stephen was not homosexual. He enjoyed the company and the conversation, but admitted that he had a girlfriend. At that moment, Dahmer experienced the feeling he found most unbearable: rejection. He understood that seducing Stephen in a conventional way would not be possible, and he did not want to let the object of his desire leave. When Stephen Hicks got up to go, Jeffrey picked up a dumbbell and struck him on the back of the head while he was turned away. The blow did not knock him unconscious, so Jeffrey struck him again. This time, Hicks lost consciousness, and Jeffrey strangled him. He then undressed the lifeless body, touched it, lay beside it, and eventually masturbated over it. Soon, reality replaced the moment of arousal. Years later, Dahmer recalled that he nearly lost his mind from fear that night and could not understand how he had gone so far. After dark, Jeffrey dragged the body beneath the house and, in a panic, began running through possible solutions in his head. The next day, he dismembered Stephen Hicks's body, cutting off the arms, legs, and head, and opening the abdomen to see what human internal organs looked like. Until then, he had seen only those of animals. Jeffrey placed the remains into garbage bags and the following night drove them to a ravine roughly 10 miles from the house to dispose of them. At 3 a.m. on June 25th, Dahmer was stopped by police. He had committed a traffic violation by making an illegal left turn from a main roadway. One of the officers noticed the garbage bags in the back seat and the foul odor coming from them. Jeffrey explained that he was transporting accumulated household trash to the city dump. Had the officers been more thorough, Dahmer's story might have ended before it truly began. 16 innocent men would have remained alive, and the account being told now would not exist. But the explanation was easy to believe. Jeffrey was issued a citation and allowed to leave. He drove straight back home. There, he removed Stephen Hicks's head from the bags and masturbated over it. Stephen belonged to him, and to him alone. The following night, Dahmer stuffed the remaining bags into a deep drainage pipe behind the house and covered them with soil. He kept the head for a short time, but eventually disposed of it as decomposition set in. Soon afterward, the Akron Municipal Court in Ohio fined Jeffrey Dahmer $20 for the traffic violation. Stephen Hicks's remains would not be discovered for another 13 years. That night in Ohio, after it, everything went wrong. Something like that ruins your entire life. After it happened, I thought I would try to live as normal a life as possible and forget about it, Dahmer later recalled. When speaking about his state of mind after the murder of Stephen Hicks, and he truly did try. For the next 10 years, Jeffrey Dahmer attempted to live a normal life while fighting his inner demons. That disastrous summer of 1978, Dahmer graduated from high school. While his classmates were deciding where to apply and what to do next, he drank. Lionel insisted that his son continue his education and effectively pushed him into Ohio State University. Dahmer's dorm mates and classmates kept their distance. He spent most of his time lying on his bed in his room, drinking heavily. He was suspected of stealing a watch, a radio, and $120 in cash from other students while they were attending lectures. His academic performance was so poor that he was expelled around Christmas. Having lasted less than a semester, Jeffrey returned home. The next destination chosen for him was the military. Lionel hoped the army would straighten him out. Jeffrey did not resist. In truth, he felt largely indifferent toward himself and his future. In 1979, in Texas, he completed a 16-week medical training course and became a qualified combat medic, knowledge he would later use, though not for the benefit of society. The following 2 years Dahmer spent with an armored division in Germany. Little is known about his life during that period. Quiet and withdrawn, he avoided fellow soldiers and joined them only when alcohol was involved. The army did not rid him of his problems. Dahmer continued drinking heavily. Alcohol was his way of keeping his inner self under control and suppressing the memory of the moment when it had broken free for the first, and so far only, time. On March 24, 1981, Jeffrey was discharged from the military due to alcohol abuse. He decided to start over in Florida. There, Dahmer rented a room and found work at a local bar. But he continued drinking away his earnings and eventually ended up on the street. For a period of time, he was effectively homeless and slept on the beach. In September 1981, Dahmer gave up. He asked his father for money to return home and went back to Ohio. Upon arriving, the first thing he did was retrieve the garbage bags containing Stephen Hicks's remains from the drainage pipe. By then, only bones remained. Dahmer scattered them throughout the nearby woods. Lionel and Sherry Dahmer were not pleased by Jeffrey's return. He continued drinking and doing nothing, and just 2 weeks later, he was arrested for drinking vodka near the entrance of a hotel. After that, his parents sent him to live with his grandmother in the small town of West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In exchange for helping around the house, his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer, gave him a place to live. Jeffrey's grandmother was a deeply religious and affectionate woman. "I think you could call her the ideal grandmother," Dahmer later said of her. "She's very kind, goes to church every Sunday, easy to get along with. She's loving, friendly, just a very sweet woman." Had Jeffrey been raised by her instead of Joyce and Lionel, his life might have turned out differently, and the world might never have known the name Jeffrey Dahmer. On the surface, it seemed as though living with his grandmother was putting him back on a righteous path. Jeffrey took care of the lawn, helped replant flowers, and in the evenings they ate dinner together and watched television. They attended church regularly and occasionally read the Bible together. Jeffrey became interested in religious texts in part because he wanted to confront the demon within himself and atone for the sin he had committed. On January 14, 1985, Dahmer found a new job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. His work was simple: pouring powdered sugar into 4 massive industrial vats, each with a capacity of 5 tons, and turning on the mixer. His life seemed monotonous and empty, but at least it appeared free of violence and any desire to kill, until one day when everything collapsed. Jeffrey Dahmer was sitting in the public library in West Allis when a stranger passed by and dropped a note onto his lap. It read, "Meet me in the men's restroom on the 2nd floor. I'll suck you off." Dahmer believed that years of living with his grandmother and attending church had finally freed him from his homosexual urges, but they came rushing back. He didn't like it. He feared that any attempt at a relationship would end the same way it had with Stephen Hicks. He did not go to the restroom, but his resistance began to weaken. Dahmer returned to compulsive masturbation, sometimes up to 4 times a day. On approximately 6 occasions, he was caught doing this in public places. It is also known that he would press his groin against people in public, but even that soon stopped being enough. At that point, Dahmer began thinking about how to obtain a man he could take to bed. The idea of forming a healthy relationship never crossed his mind. He was too timid, too distrustful, and too afraid of emotional attachment. What he wanted was not intimacy in the conventional sense, but a body, something to release the sexual tension that had been building inside him. In the summer of 1986, Jeffrey Dahmer began visiting different doctors around the city, collecting prescriptions for sleeping pills. He claimed he was having trouble adjusting to night shifts. In reality, Dahmer had started frequenting gay bathhouses, where homosexual men commonly gathered. There, he would give alcohol mixed with sleeping medication to men who caught his attention. While they were unconscious, Dahmer allowed his fantasies to play out. Many of the men later complained about him to the bathhouse staff, and gradually, Dahmer was banned from most of these establishments. He then began meeting men in bars and bringing them to a pre-arranged, inexpensive room at the Ambassador Hotel. While his partners were awake, he had little to no erection, but once they fell asleep, it would appear immediately. Dahmer masturbated over the sleeping men, touched them, rested his head on their chests and stomachs, listening to their heartbeats and the sounds of their bodies. In this way, Jeffrey found a method of achieving the closeness he desired, without resorting to murder. On September 8, 1986, 2 12-year-old boys, Richard Cohn and John Osland, were walking near a river when they encountered a man masturbating in public. They reported the incident to police, and soon afterward, based on the description provided, Officer Richard Menzel detained Jeffrey Dahmer. The boys identified him. Dahmer did not deny the encounter, though he claimed he had merely been urinating. Nevertheless, he was charged with indecent exposure and lewd conduct in a public place. This was not the first time Dahmer had masturbated in public. Previously, no charges had been filed, but this time he received a 1-year probation sentence, was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and required to attend psychological counseling. The court-appointed psychologist, Evelyn Rosen, administered several assessments to better understand Dahmer's mental state. The results indicated that he felt deeply disappointed in people, profoundly lonely, and emotionally empty. He was struggling to manage disturbing thoughts. Rosen concluded that her patient had extremely low self-esteem, saw little meaning in life, and, most importantly, did not feel obligated to follow social norms or justify himself to others. Summarizing her evaluation, Rosen wrote, "There is no doubt that Jeffrey Dahmer currently suffers from schizoid personality disorder and may exhibit pronounced paranoid tendencies. He is clearly dangerous." Clinical psychologists from the University of Wisconsin reached similarly troubling conclusions. Dahmer, they warned, could develop into a psychopathic sexual deviant with antisocial and schizoid traits. His deviant behavior is likely to continue in some form and may even escalate. Over time, he may develop a dependence on psychoactive substances, with a possible intensification of masochistic or sadistic tendencies, the report stated. Unfortunately, the court-ordered psychological evaluation of Jeffrey Dahmer was treated as little more than a bureaucratic formality. The expert's conclusions were added to his file and largely ignored, to devastating effect. In a cruel irony, Dahmer's sessions with Dr. Rosen coincided with the period when he finally stopped resisting himself altogether. On November 16, 1987, 4 days after his latest session with a psychologist, Jeffrey Dahmer met a man named Stephen Tuomi at a bar. They struck up a conversation, liked one another, and Tuomi readily agreed to go with Dahmer to the Ambassador Hotel. The next morning, Dahmer woke up beside Stephen Tuomi. He was dead. Tuomi's body was covered in bruises, as were Dahmer's hands. Dahmer remembered giving him rum mixed with cola and sleeping pills, and that they had gone to bed together. What happened after that, he could not recall. But one thing was clear. After years of restraint, he had killed again.
One time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. Had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here, was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory of it?
I have no memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again.
After regaining some composure, Dahmer went to a shopping mall and bought a large suitcase. Late that night, he placed Stephen Tuomi's body inside it, locked it, carried it outside, and called a taxi. The driver helped load the suitcase into the trunk, believing he was assisting a tourist. Dahmer brought the suitcase to his grandmother's house, placed it in the basement fruit cellar, and went to sleep. A week passed before Jeffrey was able to deal with Tuomi's remains. Everything unfolded much as it had before. Dahmer dismembered the body and packed the parts into garbage bags, which he then disposed of in a trash container. He boiled Tuomi's head in a cleaning solution and bleach, intending to keep the skull so he could masturbate to it whenever he wished. It did not work. There was not enough bleach, and the skull crumbled. For a long time, Dahmer had been satisfied with the pseudo-deaths of his partners. Stephen Tuomi, too, was supposed to wake up the next morning, but he did not. It was with him that Dahmer finally lost control and carried the act through to its end. Without fully understanding how it had happened, he had barely managed to rid himself of the ghost of Stephen Hicks, which had followed him for 10 years, and now another had appeared. Dahmer no longer had the strength to resume the struggle with himself. He stopped resisting and surrendered to the animal desire for total control over those he chose. At 1 a.m. on January 17, 1988, Dahmer stepped out of Club 219, a popular gay hangout in Milwaukee. At a nearby bus stop, he spotted a young man named James Dockstater. Dahmer offered him $50 to come back to his place and spend the night, an offer Jamie readily accepted. They boarded a bus to West Alice and were soon at the house. Upstairs, the elderly Mrs. Dahmer was asleep. She never wandered the house in the middle of the night. Free from intrusion, Dahmer and Dockstater began kissing and engaging in oral sex right there in the living room. Jeff was genuinely taken with James. He was enthralled by the young man's body and didn't want the night to end. But around 4 a.m., Dockstater announced it was time for him to leave. To Dahmer, the words were like a red rag to a bull. The thought of James walking out, vanishing forever, was unbearable. Desperate to keep him there, Jeff offered a final drink, a cocktail of coffee and Irish cream. He neglected to mention the secret ingredient, crushed sleeping pills. James drank it and soon drifted off. Dahmer began to fondle the unconscious boy and masturbate. He then carried his partner down to the basement, where he took his life. I knew my grandmother would be waking up, but I wanted him to stay with me, so I strangled him, Dahmer later said, explaining his motivation. Although James Dockstater looked much older, he was only 14. The next morning, Jeff hid the boy's body in the fruit cellar and sat down to have breakfast with his grandmother. Once she left for church, Dahmer returned to the basement to engage in anal sex with the corpse. The body remained in the basement for another week. Jeff would regularly go downstairs just to lie beside the remains in varying stages of decay. When the odor began to permeate the house and draw Catherine's attention, Dahmer methodically dismembered the body. He disposed of the remains in the trash, but bleached the skull and kept it, a grisly memento to help him imagine that James Doxtator was still with him. The next victim of Dahmer's all-consuming need to possess his objects of desire at any cost was 23-year-old Richard Guerrero. They met outside the Phoenix Bar on March 27, 1988. Following the same pattern, they went to Dahmer's home and had sex, after which Jeff drugged Richard with sedatives and strangled him. He followed his established routine, dismembering and discarding the body while bleaching the skull to add to his growing collection. A far more notable incident occurred a week later, on Easter. Jeffrey Dahmer continued lingering around gay clubs in search of another victim and met an African-American man named Ronald Flowers. They went back to Dahmer's place together. Ronald drank coffee that had been mixed with sleeping pills and lost consciousness, only to wake up later in a hospital. He had been found unconscious in a field and transported to the city by ambulance. Doctors found no traces of drug use and no signs of sexual assault, but Flowers was missing his chain, bracelet, and $200. He later noticed strange bruises on his neck. Ronald reported the incident to police, but officers found no evidence at Catherine Dahmer's house, and no charges were filed. Only 4 years later did Ronald Flowers fully understand how lucky he had been, and why Jeffrey Dahmer had not killed him, as he had so many others. Whether Flowers regained consciousness in time and escaped, or whether Dahmer simply lacked the strength to strangle him, remains unknown. One thing, however, is clear. Once again, police came dangerously close to a violent offender and let him slip away. Largely because of the incident involving Ronald Flowers, Catherine Dahmer decided that it was time for her grandson to move out. In June 1988, Dahmer rented a small apartment in Milwaukee. Along with his residence, his methods changed. He began offering men money in exchange for posing for Polaroid photographs. Under this pretext, on September 26, he lured a Laotian boy named Somsak Synthesomphone, who was 13 years old, to his apartment. Somsak agreed, and Dahmer photographed him in various poses. At one point, Somsak sensed that something was wrong. He took only a few sips of the coffee Dahmer offered him, then hurriedly left. Barely making it home, he fell into a deep sleep. His father took him to the hospital, where doctors diagnosed him with a drug overdose. After waking up, Somsak Synthesomphone told police everything. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested at his workplace, the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, and charged with second-degree sexual assault and enticement of a child for immoral purposes. More than the charges themselves, Dahmer feared the shame that came with public exposure. From that moment on, everyone at work knew that he was homosexual. During a search of Dahmer's apartment, officers found his camera, 2 photographs of Somsak, several magazines featuring nude men, and sleeping pills. Somehow, they missed the skull of Richard Guerrero, which Dahmer had kept as a memento of what he considered a pleasant evening. Once again, police failed to stop further violence before it escalated. Before the new court hearing, Jeffrey Dahmer underwent another psychiatric evaluation. Probation officer Gloria Anderson addressed the court with a statement that partially explained Dahmer's behavior. She noted that he had grown up in an environment marked by anxiety, confusion, mental health problems, and constant family conflict, conditions that ultimately destroyed the family structure itself. She went on to quote psychologist Evelyn Rosen, who had described Dahmer as a schizoid personality with paranoid traits. Anderson added a grim prognosis. Dahmer was not mentally ill at that moment, but it was only a matter of time, and alcohol was accelerating that progression. On January 30th, 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer appeared before Judge William Gardner at the Milwaukee County Safety Building and did not contest the sexual assault charges. He claimed that he had drugged the boy accidentally, saying he had failed to notice residual medication in a cup he himself had used earlier. Taking into account the assessments of Gloria Anderson and other experts, the judge sentenced Jeffrey Dahmer to 1 year in a correctional facility with work release privileges, followed by 5 years of probation. He was also allowed to continue working at the Ambrosia factory 6 days a week. Preparing to serve his sentence, Dahmer vacated his small apartment and returned to his grandmother's house in West Allis. On March 25, 1989, the urge to possess another partner returned. Dahmer went to Richard's Pharmacy, where he usually bought medication, and replenished his supply of sleeping pills. Later that evening, at a bar called The Cage in Milwaukee, a 24-year-old man named Tony Sears approached him. For the first time, Dahmer was not the one who initiated the encounter. They went back to Jeffrey's place together. At first they sat in the kitchen, then went to bed and had sex. Dahmer even asked Sears whether he would stay the night, have breakfast with him, and come back again sometime. It was the first and last attempt Jeffrey made to handle things in a normal way. Sears said he would have to leave. Dahmer then drugged him with sleeping pills and strangled him. What followed showed a further escalation of Dahmer's psychological instability, exactly what psychiatrists had warned about. He decapitated Tony Sears's body and attempted to skin it. He then removed the head and genitals. The next day, Dahmer called a taxidermist and asked how animal remains could be preserved in a way that kept both flesh and skeleton intact. He was told acetone was required. Jeffrey bought a plastic bucket at a hardware store, filled it with acetone, and left Sears's head and genitals submerged in it for a week. The container stood openly on the floor of Dahmer's bedroom. He also purchased a makeup kit and applied cosmetics to the genitals to make them appear more lifelike. After a week, the head had dried out, but still resembled that of a living person. Dahmer simulated oral sex with it. Much later, would remove the remaining tissue and preserve Tony Sears's skull, one he seemed to favor more than the others. On March 2, 1990, Dahmer was released 3 months early. Upon release, he began a 5-year probation period and was assigned a probation officer named Donnie Chester. Around the same time, Jeffrey decided he needed his own place again. In May, he rented a small apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee. In the new apartment, Dahmer painted Tony Sears's skull with granite effect paint and placed it in a prominent location. By that point, he was actively developing the idea of creating something resembling a shrine. He purchased a large black table and 2 griffin statues. In Dahmer's vision, the table would serve as an altar on which the bones and skulls of his victims would be displayed, with the griffins standing guard. In later years, Jeffrey Dahmer was never able to clearly explain why he felt compelled to build this shrine. Perhaps he believed it would allow him to connect with the souls of the dead and spend at least a little more time with them. Dahmer's 6th victim was killed 5 weeks after he moved into the apartment. On May 20th, 1990, Jeffrey met an African-American man named Raymond Smith, who went by the nickname Cash D. Dahmer offered him $50 to come back to his place and have sex. By 3 a.m., they were there. Everything followed the familiar pattern. Raymond Smith refused to stay the night without additional payment, after which Dahmer drugged him with sleeping pills and strangled him. Cash D became the first victim on whom Dahmer began experimenting, using the black table he had recently purchased. He placed the body on it and photographed it from multiple angles and in different poses. From that point on, Dahmer would photograph all of his victims with a Polaroid camera. Large numbers of these images would later be found during searches of his apartment. Smith was also the first victim whose disposal presented serious difficulties. Dismembering a body in a second-floor apartment was far more complicated than doing so in the basement of a rural house. The sound of a sledgehammer could alert neighbors, as could the stench. There was no private trash container either. Dahmer opened the body in the bathtub, separated the legs at the joints, and boiled them for an hour in a steel pot with a cleaning agent. He then washed the bones in the kitchen sink, removing the remaining flesh. He planned to preserve Smith's skeleton as part of his shrine, but without connective tissue, the bones fell apart. Dahmer bought a large trash container, placed the bones and remaining tissue inside, poured acid over them, and left it for 2 weeks. Eventually, the contents turned into a foul liquid, which he poured down the toilet. He spray painted the man's skull and placed it next to Tony Sears's skull. A week later, Dahmer made a mistake that saved a life. He brought another man back to his apartment and prepared his usual mixture of coffee and sleeping pills. At some point, he apparently mixed up the cups and soon fell into a deep sleep himself. In the morning, he discovered that $300, his watch, and some clothing were missing. Dahmer was so upset that he even complained about the incident to his probation officer, Donnie Chester. Around this time, people began noticing that Jeffrey Dahmer had stopped taking care of himself. He had always been described as neat and well-groomed, but now he rarely bathed and often wore dirty clothes. His outward appearance mirrored his internal state. Another psychological evaluation diagnosed him with a mixed personality disorder associated with depressed mood. That same summer, Dahmer met a 27-year-old African-American man named Eddie Smith. Ambitious and full of dreams, Eddie longed for fame but never achieved it. He had failed to join the Milwaukee Ballet and was also unsuccessful as a drag performer in nightclubs. After his arrest, Dahmer admitted to police that he felt like a failure after killing Eddie Smith, because nothing remained of the body and the death felt pointless. He attempted to dry Smith's skull by placing it in an oven for an hour, but the temperature was too high and the skull shattered. A couple of weeks later, Dahmer met Louis Pinay, who cleaned windows and swept floors at Club 219, a place Dahmer frequented. Dahmer offered him $200 to come home with him, pose nude for photographs, and then have sex. Pinay agreed. He spent the night with Dahmer and even stayed over. The next morning, they had breakfast together, and Louis left, promising to meet Jeffrey again later that day. It might appear that Dahmer was once again trying to pull himself together and return to a normal life. What happened could be mistaken for the beginning of a healthy relationship. It was not. Dahmer had simply run out of sleeping pills, and a new prescription had not yet been issued. He needed time to decide how he would kill the man. They met again around noon. While Pinay was lying face down on the bed posing for photographs, Dahmer struck him on the back of the head with a hammer. The blow was powerful, but not fatal. Lewis panicked and ran out of the apartment, but about 10 minutes later, he returned to ask for money to take a bus home. At that moment, Jeffrey felt rising panic, either from the fear of losing the man again, or from the fear that Pinay might tell someone about what had happened. All the more strange then was the outcome. After talking with Louis until 7 in the morning, Jeffrey put him in a taxi and sent him home. They never saw each other again. Dahmer himself never understood why he acted that way. We can only speculate. It is possible that Pinay survived because of his humanity. He had not only spent the night with Jeffrey, but had also talked with him at length, even after the hammer incident. Afterward, Louis Pinay reported the incident to police and accused Dahmer of unlawful imprisonment. However, he gave 3 different versions of events, each more chaotic than the last, and police ultimately did not believe him. Once again, fate had given Jeffrey Dahmer another chance to stop. It is hard to keep count, but Dahmer did not take the hint, and in truth, he felt he had nothing left to lose. His life had become completely colorless. He usually came home from the night shift around 8 in the morning, prepared a light breakfast, and turned on some mindless talk show. Then he went to sleep and woke up around noon, which he typically spent at the food court of the Grand Avenue Mall. He especially liked McDonald's and April Annie's, a restaurant on the first floor that served fried chicken and French fries. After eating, he wandered past the storefronts, then took the bus back home. That was his day. At one point, Dahmer returned to a childhood hobby. He bought a large aquarium, about 113 liters, and filled it with a variety of fish. He used the black table that was meant to become his altar as a stand for the tank. Jeffrey spent hours watching African cichlids, tiger barbs, and other fish. He cleaned the aquarium regularly and changed the filters. After his arrest, he recalled this period with sadness, describing it as his last attempt to do something normal and harmless. A funny hobby. I really loved that aquarium. I truly miss it, he said. The aquarium took the place of the shrine that was meant to be built from the bones of his victims. Symbolically, it would mark both the end of one phase of Jeffrey Dahmer's life and the beginning of another. But the calming effect of the fish did not last. In September 1990, he killed again. This time, the victim was Ernest Miller from Chicago. As usual, Dahmer offered money in exchange for sex and photographs. Miller agreed, drank coffee laced with sleeping pills, and fell asleep. Throughout the night, Dahmer touched, caressed, and examined his unconscious victim. He masturbated while handling the body, as if Miller were participating. But there was a problem. Dahmer had given him the last 2 sleeping pills, and the man could wake up at any moment. When Jeffrey was finished, strangling Ernest was no longer an option. He could regain consciousness and resist. Leaving him alive was not something Dahmer was willing to consider either. He resorted to an extreme measure. After drinking to steady himself, Jeffrey took a knife and slit Miller's jugular vein. For more than a minute, blood sprayed violently, covering the walls, the floor, and the bedroom carpet. That night, it seemed Dahmer finally lost all remaining restraint. After taking around 20 photographs of the victim in various poses, he severed Miller's head and began talking to it, apologizing for having used a knife. He then took more photographs of the headless body at different stages of dismemberment and of the head itself, which he placed in the refrigerator. Over the following days, he periodically took it out and masturbated. Dahmer remained obsessed with the idea of decorating his shrine with a complete human skeleton, stripped of flesh. He attempted to glue Miller's bones together so the skeleton would hold its shape. Eventually, he flayed the head, spray-painted the skull, and coated it with enamel. The murder of Ernest Miller is also significant because it marked the first time Dahmer engaged not only in sadism, but in cannibalism. He consumed parts of the victim's flesh. David Thomas, aged 22, was killed in the early morning hours of September 24, 1990. Curtis Straughter, just weeks away from turning 18, died on February 17, 1991. Errol Lindsay, who would soon have turned 19, was killed on April 7. And Tony Hughes, aged 31, murdered on May 24, 1991, was deaf and unable to speak. Dahmer wanted to preserve the skin of one of the men intact. Using a small, sharp paring knife, he made an incision along the back of the head, from the base of the neck to the crown, and then began pulling the skin away on both sides. He later said it reminded him of skinning a chicken before cooking it. Dahmer later bragged to police that he managed to remove the skin covering the skull in one piece. It resembled a mask, like the kind sold in party stores. He placed the removed skin in a solution of cold water and salt, hoping to preserve it for his shrine. After 3 weeks, however, it became clear the attempt had failed. The skin began to fall apart. Reluctantly, he tore it into pieces with his hands and flushed them down the toilet. The body he had skinned struck Dahmer as especially beautiful. One of the bodies was photographed by Jeffrey after being cut open from the neck down to the groin, with all internal organs visible. He later told investigators that he plunged his hands into the still warm intestines, feeling them from the inside. At times, he removed the intestines and rubbed them against his penis, using them as an aid during masturbation. An inevitable consequence of all this was a powerful stench that periodically spread through the apartment building. Dahmer explained to neighbors that his freezer kept breaking down and meat was spoiling. In reality, the deeper his madness progressed, the less attention he paid to disposing of remains in a timely manner. Body parts could lie in his bathroom or bedroom for days. At one point, he placed a large plastic drum inside the apartment and packed body parts directly into it. Even a tightly sealed lid failed to contain the smell. In May 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer decided to experiment. He wondered whether it was possible to keep someone with him without killing them, but also without forming a relationship. A corpse provided only temporary satisfaction, and in his disturbed mind, the idea of creating something like a living zombie took shape. That fate was intended for a 14-year-old boy named Conorak Synthesomphone. By a grim coincidence, Jeffrey encountered the younger brother of Somsak Synthesomphone, the boy who had previously managed to escape him years earlier. Dahmer met Conorak on the street and offered him $50 to pose for photographs. At first, Conorak refused, but eventually agreed to go home with the stranger. Did he remember what had happened to his brother years before? Possibly. That may be why he hesitated. Whatever the case, they boarded a bus together and soon arrived at Jeffrey's apartment. Dahmer took several photographs of Conorak posing in his underwear, then drugged him. For several hours, Jeffrey fondled the boy's body and performed oral sex on him before moving on to the next stage. He took a drill and bored a small hole into Conorak's skull at the top of the head. Using a syringe, Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid into the victim's brain. In crude terms, his goal was to reduce Conorak to a vegetative state, alive, yet not fully alive. At around 1:30 a.m., Dahmer left the sleeping Conorak in the living room and went to a nearby bar to drink beer. He was gone for about half an hour. During that time, completely naked, Konorak regained consciousness and somehow managed to escape the apartment. Barely able to walk, swaying as if intoxicated, he stumbled down the street, repeatedly collapsing. Eventually, several women noticed him. They assumed he was under the influence of drugs and did not see the hole in his head. His thick hair concealed it, and the bleeding had already stopped. At that moment, Jeffrey Dahmer approached the scene. He took the boy by the elbow and told the women that Konorak was his friend, that he had had too much to drink, and that he would take care of him. Konorak resisted, flailed his arms, and at one point even clung to a tree. This alarmed the bystanders further, and they called the police. Police officers Joseph Gabrish and John Balkerzak arrived at the scene just 6 minutes later and found a crowd of at least 15 people gathered around. Dahmer began explaining that the young man was his partner and that he often behaved strangely, sometimes running around naked after drinking too much. Jeffrey was open, calm, and seemingly sincere. He showed no signs of anxiety, which put the officers at ease. They suggested that Dahmer take his partner back to the apartment and even assisted him when Konorak began to resist. In this way, Konorak's synthesomphone was delivered straight back to his killer. The officers briefly glanced around the apartment and left. An hour later, Konorak was dead. Dahmer injected another syringe of acid into his brain, and the boy did not survive. Dahmer decapitated the body, dissected it, photographed it, and on May 28th, disposed of the remains. The following day, he attended a scheduled meeting with his probation officer, Donald Chester, and stated that he had no serious problems. In reality, there were many. Management at the Ambrosia chocolate factory was threatening to fire Dahmer for chronic absenteeism. The building supervisor, Mr. Principali, warned that he would evict him because of the persistent stench coming from the apartment. Chester sensed that something was wrong and referred Dahmer to a physician who prescribed several powerful antidepressants. But by that point, no medication, no matter how strong, could have saved him. On June 30th, Dahmer met Matt Turner, aged 20, at a bus stop in Chicago. He brought him back to Milwaukee and strangled him. 5 days later, again in Chicago, Dahmer encountered Jeremy Weinberger. He drilled a hole into his skull and poured boiling water into it. Weinberger lingered for 2 days, delirious, before dying. Jeremy lived with his father while saving money for college and dreamed of building a career in graphic design. On July 15, Dahmer met Oliver Lacey, aged 23, on the street. He brought him to his apartment and strangled him. Lacey was a handsome black bodybuilder. Dahmer intended to preserve his head and skeleton as centerpiece decorations for his shrine. That same day, Jeffrey was suspended from his job at Ambrosia for missing a record number of work days. It is unlikely Dahmer paid this any attention at all. Unwashed, unshaven, resembling a berserker from Norse sagas, he was no longer able to stop himself, strangling, cutting, dismembering. For the week between July 12th and July 19th, apartment 213 truly became a branch of hell on earth. In one room, Dahmer massaged Oliver Lacey's body, while in the bathroom, submerged in cold water and bleach, floated the corpse of Jeremy Weinberger. Soon, Lacey's body joined it, and Dahmer found himself showering alongside 2 corpses at once. He later suspended Oliver Lacey's body from the shower curtain rod and photographed the mutilated remains. The chest cavity opened and exposed. Dahmer's final victim was Joseph Braidhoft. He killed him on July 19th and left the body on the bed for 2 days, covering it with a blanket. On July 21st, he uncovered the corpse and found that the head was already infested with maggots. He severed it, cleaned it, and placed it in the freezer. On July 22nd, Dahmer was lingering near a bar when he spotted 3 men, one of whom had asked him for a cigarette twice over the previous few weeks. That man was Tracy Edwards. Jeffrey struck up a conversation, said he was terribly bored, and offered each of them $100 to come back to his place and keep him company. Only Tracy agreed. Soon, they were at Dahmer's apartment. On the floor lay 4 boxes of hydrochloric acid, which Jeffrey claimed he used to clean bricks. Tracy already regretted coming, but decided that if he stayed calm, he could get out safely. Dahmer, meanwhile, was visibly agitated. Seizing a moment, he snapped handcuffs onto Edwards' wrists. Tracy demanded that he take them off. Jeffrey tried to play it off as a joke and promised to give him the key soon, but first suggested they watch The Exorcist 2 together. Lately, Dahmer had been showing the film to many of his victims. Tracy realized he was dealing with an unstable psychopath. Dahmer's mood shifted from minute to minute, one moment friendly, the next threatening him with a knife. Jeffrey unlocked the handcuffs, but only so Edwards could undress. While Tracy was in the bathroom, Dahmer sat on the edge of the bed watching the movie, rocking back and forth and softly humming to himself. They lay together briefly in front of the television. Jeffrey rested his head on Tracy's chest, listening to his heartbeat. When he tried to cuff him again, Edwards broke free and fled the apartment. Late on the night of July 22nd, 1991, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a police patrol car driven by officers Rolf Mueller and Robert Roth was flagged down by a 32-year-old black man named Tracy Edwards. Ordinarily, disturbances at the corner of Kilburn Avenue and North 25th Street were nothing unusual. But this time, there was one detail that stood out. A handcuff dangled from Edwards' left wrist. Terrified, Tracy asked the officers for only one thing: to free him. He did not mention Dahmer at all. Had the officers been able to remove the handcuffs easily, Edwards would likely have disappeared into the surrounding yards, and Dahmer might once again have escaped justice. But this time, luck was not on Dahmer's side. The cuffs would not open. The officers asked Tracy to take them to the place where he had been restrained. Edwards led Mueller and Roth to the address without hesitation. 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213. There was no need to shout police or force the door. After several knocks, Jeffrey Dahmer himself opened it. Slightly pale but composed, he calmly invited the officers inside and began answering their questions in the small living room. Dahmer admitted that he had handcuffed Edwards and said that the key was in the bedroom. As Mueller and Roth moved in that direction, Dahmer suddenly lunged toward the room, as if remembering something, but the officers ordered him to step back. The tension in the cramped apartment rose sharply. Formerly melancholic, Dahmer now appeared nervous. Upon entering the bedroom, Mueller immediately noticed a knife near the bed and, in an open dresser drawer, Polaroid photographs of naked men, or so it seemed at first glance. Looking closer, he realized in horror that the torsos in the photos had been slit open, like butchered carcasses. Other images were even more explicit: severed heads, arms and legs. At that moment, Jeffrey Dahmer snapped and tried to flee. A struggle followed, but against 2 sober police officers, he stood no chance. Around midnight, Dahmer was face down on the floor, handcuffed. Tracy Edwards was still there, and told the officers that something terrible was inside the refrigerator. Dahmer had offered his guests beer from it. Officer Rolf Müller opened the fridge and found on the bottom shelf a cardboard box. Inside, facing upward, lay the severed head of a black man. It was now clear they had captured a dangerous killer. Shortly after 1 a.m., apartment 213 was crowded with police officers and emergency personnel. For many of them, the night that lay ahead would become the most horrifying of their lives. Among the relatively mundane items, investigators found a large collection of pornographic films. Of the non-erotic movies, Dahmer obsessively rewatched The Exorcist II and Star Wars: Return of the Jedi. In the kitchen stood 4 bottles of hydrochloric acid. Inside the refrigerator, in addition to a human head, police discovered 2 human hearts sealed in plastic bags and a piece of muscle tissue. In a separate freezer, officers found 3 more severed heads, a male torso, and several bags containing internal organs. In the hallway stood a dresser where Dahmer kept sleeping pills, formaldehyde, and chloroform, substances he used to subdue his victims. Nearby were 2 bleached human skulls. On the floor behind the dresser was a large aluminum stockpot. Inside were 2 human hands, a penis, testicles, and part of the pubic area. In the bedroom, forensic specialists found traces of blood on the pillowcase and the walls. Next to the bed, inside a metal locker, were 3 additional human skulls painted green. In the bottom drawer of that locker lay a complete human skeleton. Beside it were dried remains of a human scalp and another set of genitals, also dried and mummified. On the floor next to the locker stood a box containing 2 more skulls. But the most horrifying discovery was in the far corner of the room, a large blue plastic barrel. Inside were 3 human bodies at different stages of decomposition. This was the source of the stench Dahmer's neighbors had been complaining about for months. Amid the severed genitals, dismembered limbs, and decaying corpses, apartment 213 also contained oddly benign objects. Among them were a King James Bible, audio tapes titled The Flood, Genesis, the Bible, Science and the Age of the Earth, Numerology and the Explanation of the Divine Triangle, and a set of instructional books and tapes for learning Latin. And finally, among all this hell, investigators found several books on aquarium care and a well-maintained aquarium filled with exotic fish. The small living ecosystem inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment was the only detail that suggested a human being lived there. Meanwhile, Detective Patrick Kennedy transported Dahmer to the police station for interrogation. The interview lasted nearly 6 hours, from around 1:30 a.m. until 7:15 in the morning. Dahmer chose to confess to everything, explaining that he needed to unburden his soul. He fully understood what he had done, and by his own admission, was relieved to have been caught. Dahmer confessed that over the previous 4 years, he had murdered 16 people. He described how he decapitated, dismembered, and destroyed the bodies, disposing of what remained in the trash. He admitted that he kept some of the skulls and dissolved other bodies in acid until nothing was left. He stated that it all began with the murder and dismemberment of Stephen Hicks in Ohio in 1978, and added an unsolicited observation. It takes roughly an hour to boil a human head. On July 23rd, another investigator, Detective Dennis Murphy, heard most of Dahmer's confession. Over the course of the investigation, Murphy spent a total of about 60 hours with him. Murphy's primary task was to identify all of Dahmer's victims. For this reason, Dahmer was made to examine photographs of missing persons for hours on end, carefully pointing out those he recognized as his victims. He said he did it to bring peace to the victims' families. I understand that it's very little, insignificantly little, but I don't know what else I can do for them, Dahmer said. At the very least, this is something I can do. The detectives were not prepared to take Dahmer at his word, so they deliberately mixed photographs of actual missing persons with pictures of random, unrelated people. Dahmer was put through the test. He answered honestly, saying when he had never seen a person before, and carefully identifying those who had disappeared because of him. Given how thoroughly Dahmer destroyed physical remains, many of his victims would never have been identified had he been less cooperative. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer began on January 30th, 1992, and lasted a little over 2 weeks. Dahmer initially refused legal representation, stating that he did not believe he deserved any kind of defense. Nevertheless, his father, Lionel Dahmer, hired attorney Gerald Boyle to represent his son. Opposing Boyle was the Milwaukee County District Attorney, the relentless Michael McCann. Defending Dahmer was, to put it mildly, an impossible task. Boyle had little choice but to push a single core argument. While Dahmer was not legally insane, he clearly suffered from severe mental abnormalities. Boyle's defense focused on Dahmer's sexual deviancy, childhood trauma, and everything that might evoke understanding or compassion from the jury. A man crushed by life, chewed up and spat out. The goal was to prove that Dahmer was driven not by a desire to kill, but by psychological disorder. The jury resisted this argument, aided by the prosecution and its witnesses, who portrayed the defendant as fully sane, calculating, cold, and merciless. According to the prosecution, a completely rational Jeffrey Dahmer showered while 2 corpses lay in the bathtub, drilled holes into people's skulls to turn them into obedient companions, and kept 11 human heads and 2 complete skeletons for use in his homemade shrine. Psychiatrists testifying for both the prosecution and the defense agreed on one thing. Jeffrey Dahmer suffered from severe psychological disorders, most notably necrophilia. Where they diverged was on the question of free will. The prosecution maintained that his mental issues were not severe enough to deprive him of self-control. The defense argued the opposite, that Dahmer acted on impulse, automatically, unable to resist his compulsions. Dahmer himself made no effort to appear insane in order to help his lawyer. He did not claim to hear voices, experience hallucinations, or suffer from any of the symptoms that might have swayed the jury. Instead, they saw a calm, thoughtful, and quiet man on the witness stand, someone who looked far too normal to be declared legally insane and sent to a psychiatric facility instead of prison. In mid-February 1992, the jury found Jeffrey Dahmer sane and guilty of 15 murders committed in the state of Wisconsin. He was sentenced to approximately 1,000 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 70. In his final statement, Dahmer expressed remorse and asked to be put to death, but Wisconsin did not have the death penalty.
Stand right now.
Your Honor, it is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself. This was a case to tell the world that I did what I did not for reasons of hate. I hated no one. I knew I was sick or evil or both. Now I believe I was sick. The doctors have told me about my sickness, and now I have some peace. I know how much harm I have caused. I tried to do the best I could after the arrest to make amends, but no matter what I did, I could not undo the terrible harm I have caused. My attempt to help identify the remains was the best that I could do, and that was hardly anything. I feel so bad for what I did to those poor families, and I understand their rightful hate. I know I will be in prison for the rest of my life. I know that I will have to turn to God to help me get through each day. I should have stayed with God. I tried and failed and created a holocaust. Thank God there will be no more harm that I can do. I believe that only the Lord Jesus Christ can save me from my sins. I have instructed Mr. Boyle to end this matter. I do not want to contest the civil case. I've told Mr. Boyle to try and finalize them if he can. If there is ever any money, I want it to go to the victims' families. I've talked to Mr. Boyle about other things that might help ease my conscience in some way of coming up with ideas on how to make some amends to these families, and I will work with him on that. I want to return to Ohio and quickly end that matter so that I can put all of this behind me and then come right back here to do my sentence. I decided to go through this trial for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was to let the world know that these were not hate crimes. I wanted the world in Milwaukee, which I deeply hurt, to know the truth of what I did. I didn't want unanswered questions. All the questions have now been answered. I wanted to find out just what it was that caused me to be so bad and evil. But most of all, Mr. Boyle and I decided that maybe there was a way for us to tell the world that if there are people out there with these disorders, maybe they can get some help before they end up being hurt or hurting someone. I think the trial did that. I take all the blame for what I did. I hurt many people. The judge in my earlier case tried to help me, and I refused his help, and he got hurt by what I did. I hurt those policemen in the Conorak matter, and I shall ever regret causing them to lose their jobs, and I hope and pray that they can get their jobs back because I know they did their best, and I just plain fooled them. For that, I am so sorry. I know I hurt my probation officer, who was really trying to help me. I am so sorry for that, and sorry for everyone else that I have hurt. I have hurt my mother and father and stepmother. I love them all so very much. I hope that they will find the same peace I am looking for. Mr. Boyle's associates, Wendy and Ellen, have been wonderful to me, helping me through this worst of all times. I want to publicly thank Mr. Boyle. He didn't need to take this case. But when I asked him to help me find the answers and to help others, if I could, he stayed with me and went way overboard in trying to help me. Mr. Boyle and I agreed that it was never a matter of trying to get off. It was only a matter of which place I would be housed the rest of my life, not for my comfort, but for trying to study me in the hopes of helping me and learning to help others who might have problems. I know I will be in prison. I pledge to talk to doctors who might be able to find some answers. In closing, I just want to say that I hope God has forgiven me. I know society will never be able to forgive me. I know the families of the victims will never be able to forgive me for what I have done. I promise I will pray each day to ask for their forgiveness when the hurt goes away, if ever. I have seen their tears, and if I could give my life right now to bring their loved ones back, I would do it. I'm so very sorry. Your Honor, I know that you are about to sentence me. I ask for no consideration. I want you to know that I have been treated perfectly by the deputies who have been in your court and the deputies who work the jail. The deputies have treated me very professionally, and I want everyone to know that. They have not given me special treatment. Here is a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of who I am the worst. But for that very reason I was shown mercy, so that in me, the worst of sinners, Christ Jesus might display his unlimited patience as an example for those who would believe in him and receive eternal life. Now to the King eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. I know my time in prison will be terrible, but I deserve whatever I get because of what I have done. Thank you, Your Honor, and I am prepared for your sentence, which I know will be the maximum. I ask for no consideration.
Jeffrey Dahmer's final place of residence was cell 648 at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. It was a small room, about 6 square meters, but it came with a television and a VCR. Prison life in its monotony was not all that different from his life on the outside. Accustomed to working night shifts, Dahmer usually woke up around noon, which often caused him to miss daytime recreation. The rest of the time, he spent watching television or reading. He had access to the prison library. Even behind bars, Dahmer did not lose his dark sense of humor. At one point, he taped a mock notice to his wall that read, "Cannibals Anonymous meeting this Saturday at 6 p.m. Bring a friend." For a long time, he was hesitant to attend prison church services, but eventually he decided to go and soon became a regular at Christian meetings. Despite objections from some inmates, Chaplain Roy Ratcliffe allowed Dahmer to attend the services. As is often the case, inmate Jeffrey Dahmer attracted not only hatred, but also admirers. Thousands of people wanted to visit him, but permission was granted only to Lionel Dahmer, attorney Gerald Boyle, and detectives involved in the case. Joyce Dahmer, Jeffrey's mother, never visited him in prison and never wrote him a single letter. Shortly after his arrest, she reverted to her maiden name and later attempted suicide, reportedly after seeing photographs of her son in prison. One Sunday evening, after a church service, Dahmer was on his way to dinner when 2 inmates suddenly grabbed him and pinned him to the floor, while a third attempted to slash his throat with a razor. Guards reacted quickly and saved him, though he was left with a visible scar on his neck. It was the first failed attempt on Dahmer's life in prison. Several months later, Dahmer was assigned a prison job cleaning showers and toilets. On November 28, 1994, he went to work as usual alongside inmates Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. Anderson was serving time for the murder of his wife and was known for his volatile temper. Scarver was imprisoned for robbery and murder. He claimed to be divinely chosen and often said he had been sent by God on a special mission. A few hours later, Jeffrey Dahmer was dead, having suffered multiple blows to the head. The exact sequence of events remains unclear. For a long time, the prevailing version held that Christopher Scarver suddenly snapped, grabbed a mop handle, and began beating Jeffrey Dahmer with it. Jesse Anderson hesitated for a long time, and when he finally tried to intervene, he, too, was attacked. A few hours later, guards discovered a grim scene in the prison shower area: the blood-soaked tile floor and the mutilated bodies of Dahmer and Anderson. Neither could be saved. 21 years later, Christopher Scarver told the New York Post about his relationship with Dahmer and offered a different version of what he claimed was the true account of that day. Dahmer, Scarver said, had always irritated him. He was disturbed by Jeffrey's grotesque jokes. At mealtimes, Dahmer would sometimes arrange prison food on his tray to resemble severed limbs, covering it with ketchup to imitate blood. Scarver carried a newspaper clipping in his pocket describing Dahmer's crimes. He reread it constantly, growing angrier each time. Scarver was particularly enraged by the fact that many of Dahmer's victims were African American. Being black himself, Scarver harbored deep resentment toward white people, whom he blamed for his own misfortunes. On November 28, 1994, his patience finally ran out. When the inmates split up for their cleaning assignments and Dahmer went to clean the staff locker room near the showers, Scarver followed him. In the adjacent gym, Scarver took a metal bar, approached Dahmer, and beat him to death. Anderson, who who was cleaning in a nearby room, was killed next. Shortly after Dahmer's death, a conspiracy theory surfaced, claiming that he was still alive and that the killing had been an elaborate staging, supposedly orchestrated by Lionel Dahmer. Needless to say, the theory does not withstand even basic scrutiny. What is known for certain is that on November 28, 1994, inmate Christopher Scarver beat inmate Jeffrey Dahmer to death, bringing the story of the Milwaukee monster to its definitive end. An autopsy later showed that, unlike Jesse Anderson, Dahmer did not attempt to defend himself, perhaps because he believed such an ending was exactly what he deserved. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is the story of a man locked in a battle with overwhelming loneliness, childhood trauma, and the mental disorders that grew out of it. A man who resisted the demons in his head for a long time, but ultimately proved weaker than them, and in losing that fight, committed horrific acts. Nothing he did deserves justification. Of course not. But it does demand understanding, at the very least, psychological understanding. Jeffrey Dahmer's emotional world and psyche were never properly formed. The wrong turn likely happened early in childhood, at a time when a child needs his mother most. She is supposed to teach emotional regulation, to show what love and care look like, to instill empathy. But Joyce Dahmer, struggling with depression and deep self-absorption, could barely help herself, let alone her son. Jeffrey was left alone, never learning how to build healthy human relationships. Another blow came with the infamous surgeries to correct inguinal hernias. At the age of 4, children are striving for independence, learning to exist as separate beings. A violent intrusion into that fragile autonomy can leave a deep psychological scar. That is what happened to Jeffrey Dahmer. At a tender age, a stranger cut into his body. Just as he had begun to feel like a person, rather than an extension of his mother, he became an object in someone else's hands. Perhaps this experience contributed to the development of Dahmer's necrophilic tendencies. As an adult, he placed himself in the role of that same stranger, trying to compensate for childhood trauma and reclaim the sense of control he had lost so early in life. Perhaps. Only now, that control extended not just over his own existence, but over the lives of others. Jeffrey feared building relationships any other way, because he remembered how they always ended, with him alone. And that's where I'll leave it. Share your thoughts on this man and everything he did. That's all for today. But before we wrap up, I just want to say this. YouTube no longer monetizes content like this. If you enjoy these videos and want to see more, consider supporting the channel. There's a link in the description below. Don't forget to leave a comment, hit that like button, and while you're waiting for the next episode, check out my other videos, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching till the end. This is Room 13, signing off.